I'm part of this catchy residency right now. I'm working with two different institutes from two different departments. So the first department of clinical psychology of the university, and also the Hans-Knöll Institute. So it opened me like kind of like wide range of meetings and encounters. And I think the reason I actually really was super excited about like joining this project, it was because I had the chance to meet people that was actually working on the psychological aspect of psyche in a way. So I started to work first with the clinical department of psychology, which has with Ivan Friedrich, which has this research based on how touch can have an effect on physiological processes. So how touch can actually reduce stress, for instance. And I found it really interesting to see how then by a contact in between two people, you can try to, through collecting data, to analyze how this touch can affect the person. Back to a text that was really important for me at some point, which is called The Intruder from Jean-Luc Nancy, L'intrus. So it's a text he wrote just after he had a heart transplant. And it's a French philosopher that actually always worked on this idea of the body in a way. And by having this heart transplant and by describing this experience, this really strong experience for him, he explained how this feeling of strangeness appeared into him, firstly by the feeling of having something lost. Because when his heart stopped functioning, then he has this first feeling of strangeness, because he could feel his heart at this time. Because you never really realize your organs before they start failing, you know? And I found this, like the way he introduced that was actually really moving. And then he also explained that this feeling of strangeness also obviously was increased when he got something from someone else. And then he had this whole philosophical and almost posing those ontological questions about why is it to be a self? How do you build up your self-consciousness? And then he linked those questions of immunity and identity. Because basically the way immunity works, it's your body that's gonna react through what it's considered as something from the outside. So it has this kind of like beautifully written and almost really physical and identifical also. You really identify yourself as him at this time, and it's a really complex text, the way it's written. But the way he actually, so talking about this idea of rejection, and then he also manages to explain that the only way he accepted this organ from someone else was by building this idea that the identity is not fixed. The identity has to be plastic. The identity has to be crossed. The identity is not something which is like a block of marble. It has to be fluid. It's crossed all the time. And he really wants to take down this fiction that the body is considered as something as a unity in a way. And it's really beautiful the way he managed to do it through his own experience of loss and graft. And so I took this book as the starting point for my research, because I thought it was kind of linking the question of self-consciousness, of immunity. That was actually the things I was seeing with the research from the scientists. And I kind of tried not to translate it at all, but to apply it to my own way of working. I think, first of all, my practice is really kind of closely connected to the materials I use, because I always choose them for specific reasons. For the intrinsic qualities, the way they could transform the load they could carry in a way, because I never see them as just like isolated materials. I always see them like things that could be potentially express something, a certain physicality or a certain idea of having those materials embodying something in a way. I first of all started to work with metal, which is a material that I use a lot, because it kind of sometimes it's easily identified as something strong and rigid. And I kind of through the operations that I did, to make it vulnerable in a way. So I used this really like classic technique of welding. So welding, it's basically you melt the metal and then you connect two parts because they melt together. So yeah, there's this idea of like merging two parts together. But what I did, which is kind of like completely absurd in a way, and would have never been done in kind of like in an industrial context, is to weld two metals that are completely different. So I weld stainless steel with like carbon steel. So one really reacts to the conditions of the outside world. It's really porous, it's going to rust. But the stainless steel itself, then really, it's going to be protected by an oxide. So it's not going to rust, it's going to last. But by connecting them together, then this welding mark appears like something which is not going to stay long, it's going to rust also. And I found it was a nice way to evoke this idea of merging things together in a kind of precarious way. I also worked after that with this series of sculptures, and I also extended another series that I started to work on that are called Core, number 1, number 2, and I'm presenting number 3 and number 4, which are basically plaster sculptures that are castings, that are molds of forms I create. But I don't want to keep the form I create. This form is basically a form which is really organic, which is a kind of hybridization of body parts, but also of protection. To create this form out of clay and then casting it and then take it to make this original form vanish and disappear. And I don't want to see it anymore. But what remains is the cast, is the mold, is the negative. So it creates really like a kind of, it feels almost like a ghost is there, like there's a missing part. And I really like this idea because then there's this missing part and this space, it's a space for projection in a way. Or you can, the viewer can really identify himself in it because it's empty, it's hollowed out, it's extracted. Then to also combine this research that I started with the microbiologists from the Hans-Knöll Institute were also completely crazy because then I was like going to a different scale. I was going to a microscopic scale, something that you can't really see. And what they try to do actually in their research is to perceive and to observe with using like high resolution microscopy how the membrane of the cell is formed and where does it stops and how a human cell is actually delimited by it, but then also then becomes, by observing it, you can also then realize how it gets crossed by another, by the pathogen in a way. And their whole research is about trying to define how to observe this limit. I think it was really interesting to see how the biologists also try to tend towards representation of what they observe on the microscope. And actually I've been fascinated by a new technology that's been developed like I think 10 years ago, which is called an organ on a chip. So it's actually coming from, because usually what you will see on a microscope will be like on a small sample, and you will see one cell interacting with one thing you infected, for instance, with. So you only observe kind of extracted things from the reality, because you look at how one cell behaves in contact of one infection agent. And through this technology of organ on a chip, so it's basically like a computer chip with a small screen, like a small piece of glass, so you can observe it on the microscope. And so you can see what they do is they put some valves and some pumps, and in this small chip, then there's a hair flows. For instance, you put lung cells, but you can also put human cells. You kind of recreate a small utopia. You create a small world. You create a small organism. So then what you observe on the microscope becomes a kind of simulation of how the body behaves or reacts, or how physiological processes are also involved in all those parameters. I really appreciated the way they managed to appreciate that too, because they were sharing their researches to me, and they were really super excited to see how my own research will link that in a way.